In particular, the human rights monitoring mechanisms, such as the treaty bodies and special procedures, harvest very relevant information and guidance for the members of the CFS to draft guidelines that uphold the gender equality, women's and girls' autonomy over their bodies, and contribute to eliminate the gender gap in food security. For example, the UN human rights treaty bodies have been interpreting the principle of non-discrimination and equality, a cornerstone of international human rights law, has to include discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status. Even the General Assembly, in its resolution 67/168, has urged states to ensure the effective protection of the right to life and investigate promptly and thoroughly all killings committed for any discriminatory reasons, and includes expresses in an explicit way, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Human Rights Council has created a mandate on this topic, an independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And the independent expert has observed in his thematic reports how discriminatory laws and sociocultural norms continue to marginalize and exclude LGBTIQ persons from education, healthcare, housing, employment and occupation, and other sectors, creating obstacles to their enjoyment of the right to food. And as such, he has also recommended implementing programs and policies for the social inclusion of LGBTIQ persons and mainstreaming LGBTIQ+ issues across wider programs, including health, education, employment, housing, poverty reduction, food security, and access to justice. So to start off this first part of the discussion that will really look at how the different dimensions of gender-based discrimination impact the right to food, I'm going to give the floor to Suad Mahmoud, who will share with us the lived experiences of those who experience discrimination on the basis of their gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and the impact it has on their enjoyment of the right to food. Thank you, Suad. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité que vous me donnez pour m'exprimer un tout petit peu.
Merci to speak a little. I mean, these won't be many words, but I would say that we do agree on one thing, that food is one of the intangible rights to life. We all agree upon that. And I really hope that that is enshrined correctly. It is the supreme value. It is one of the supreme values of human rights. It is therefore an inalienable and imprescriptible right, guaranteeing the possibility of expressing physical and individual freedoms. This right is present in all international conventions, and first and foremost, the United Nations Covenant of 1966, which was the first text to stipulate the right to food by name. However, in hospitals, as we know, hospitals which are supposed to be the privileged place of care, surveys show us, all surveys show, that this right is only partially taken into account. Even today, it is said that it is normal to lose weight in hospital, that people, when you're in hospital, you lose weight. And this is something, there's discrimination which is seen. It is rife often in hospital. And that is a clear sign of discrimination. Nutrition International believes that good nutrition and gender equality in its diversity are mutually reinforcing, as improved nutrition enhances gender equality and gender equality enhances nutrition. But in these guidelines, in these voluntary guidelines of the CFS on gender equality and women's empowerment, this is indeed a challenge. In the context of the post-pandemic food security in the context of the post-pandemic, food security and nutrition are to have a real impact on the lives of people in the territories only if we have an equitable and sustainable food system, which is centered on the realization of human rights, with agroecology at the heart of agricultural work and our daily lives. We cannot speak about equality and equity in these systems if we do not address these systems at their root. We also have to promote and encourage local food systems and territorial markets. The pandemic has shown the gaps here. It has shown that actually it is local markets and territorial markets that actually feed people. That was the case during the pandemic. The obstacles faced by women living in occupied territories are severe. We cannot speak about equality and equity, and we cannot overcome discrimination unless we are able to bring about change in terms of these obstacles which impede the realization of the right to food. The obstacles that women face in occupied territories and under particular land tenure regimes are serious, and these impede the realization of the right to food. We have many examples of this in the occupied lands of Palestine. Food security throughout the whole of the pandemic has been ignored to a large degree. Integrating an intersectional perspective and including an explicit recognition for gender diversity is central. If we cannot enshrine within these texts the rights for those who are different, those who are diverse, well, there are women, but there is huge diversity in terms of our bodies, in terms of how we live, in terms of our aspirations. And if this is not enshrined, we cannot actually aspire towards equality in terms of nutrition. This gender diversity needs to be taken into account, and it must become a source of richness, a source of wealth for human beings, the wealth of people who are different, who are diverse. This should be strengthened. It should not be and yet another example of discrimination. Women and those of diverse genders suffer this in their bodies and in their lives. Violence. We know that there is domestic violence, there is violence that women have suffered for many different reasons. This violence has been exacerbated, and if we are to give figures just for Tunisia alone, each day we have 100 women in large cities who are beaten, and this is in the large cities where they can report it, and but there must be many more unreported cases. We don't have all of the figures, so we cannot even imagine what the situation must be like at global level. So if we're talking about gender equality, we cannot forget gender violence or discrimination. Any form of discrimination. Discrimination, it happens in many different forms. And one of the main forms is sexual or sex-specific discrimination. Gender-specific discrimination guarantees for and protection of the right to land and access to water, as well as natural resources for all gender in its diversities, is of utmost importance. So this means that there is exclusion of those men, women, human beings, simply because of their sexual orientation and their diversity. We are free, and human rights tells us that we are free to live our lives and our bodies as we like. And after the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, which we have not yet overcome, it is urgent here and now to promote clear public policies. And we heard this from the Syrian representative. It's central, it is of utmost importance that we promote public policies, instruments, and frameworks against sexual and gender-based violence and discrimination. There is also an urgent need to address the structural violence created by the current economic system, war, conflict, occupation, and the current climate crisis. There is an urgent need to guarantee the right to food for those communities that are severely affected. And I believe that these guidelines can help us. They can act as a central core, a text which can help generations with their aspirations, many generations who aspire towards equality, gender equality, empowerment, their rights, and having their diversity taken into account. Equality is central. Many women just want to have one plot of land so that they can feed their children, so that they can feed the people. And we've seen this throughout COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suad, for showing us the different dimensions of gender inequality and how it has an impact on the enjoyment of the right to food, and how you reminded us that violence is actually a form of discrimination in all its dimensions. And now, moving to our interactive part, I will now engage the other speakers in a discussion. And I'm going to move now to Jemima Nuki from UN Women. And see with her what she could share with us on what are some considerations she could share on why and how women suffer more during global food crisis, and if UN Women has also evidence on how other people who have been historically subjected to discrimination to their sexual orientation and gender identity, how do they face this global crisis. Thank you, Jemima. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation because as you heard, as UN Women, we have been supporting the CFS on developing the voluntary guidelines. And this is really important for us because we want to keep progressing on how we are addressing gender equality in the context of food and nutrition security. But let me go back to your question of how crisis really disproportionately affects women. Right now, what we are facing is a multiple crisis, and I know there's a lot of numbers being talked about in terms of what this crisis means. There's a cost of living crisis, there's a food crisis, but what I like to remind people is behind those numbers are actually real people, lives of people, women and children that are sleeping hungry. It is not just a food crisis or a cost of living crisis. It is a human crisis, and we need to start putting the faces of people on that crisis, because it's very easy to come to Rome and talk about these numbers and forget that we are actually talking about real people. And for millions of women and girls in all their diversity around the world, who actually are playing such a significant role in food systems, in producing food, cultivating lands, and cultivating lands in a lot of cases that they do not own, that they do not have rights to, who are preparing food for their families, but who are also part of the distribution system for food. What we are starting to see is the crisis, including building up from the pandemic, how much impact it is having on them. And what we see is even in times of peace, in times of stability, we know there are already gender gaps and gender inequalities that exist. And when war happens, when we add climate change, when we add the pandemic, these impacts just become much, much bigger. So women already had unequal access to land and other productive resources, assets, income, savings, and social protection. And so there's increasing cost of food, and decreasing access to food means that gender gaps are widening as household income decreases, with serious violation of their right to food and their right to an adequate standard of living. We've been following the data from FAO, and this gender gap in food insecurity is actually growing. It was about 1.7% in 2019, as I said earlier. Now it is at 4%. This looks like a very small percentage, but it actually does mean that today we have 150 million women than men who are hungry. Now, when the crisis in Ukraine started, we partnered with CARE International to actually go into Ukraine and do some rapid assessments of what was going on. And already a couple of months after the crisis, we were seeing women eating less food, and especially Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, gender diverse persons, women who are living in rural and remote areas. What I would also like to say is we also see these gaps much bigger for women who have historically suffered discrimination and marginalization, whether it's based on sexual orientation and gender identities, gender diverse persons, and there is evidence that they are actually at a greater risk of poverty, food insecurity, and general marginalization. Some of these actually really comes to life when you really think about the realities. I come from Kenya, and one of the things we were really discussing during COVID is how many gender diverse persons who couldn't live in rural areas. So they lost their jobs in urban areas. But because of some of the very strong cultural perceptions about having different gender identities, sexual orientation, they cannot go back and farm. They cannot go back to rural areas. They cannot go back to their homes because the risk of violence, the risk of death is so high. And so if we do not address some of those issues, sometimes they seem very removed from people's realities, but they are actually the realities of so many people. We have recently also just launched a brief of some of the data on the gender issues around the global crisis. The UN Secretary General convened a global crisis response group that was composed of a couple of countries as champions and most of the UN agencies as members. And they launched these briefs that were sort of talking about what is the situation in the world around food, energy, and finances. And believe you me, even in this UN system, the first two briefs had no mention of women, just the basic women or girls, leave alone talking about women in their total diversity. It had no mention of women and girls. And so we literally wrote to the Deputy Secretary General and to the DG of UNCTAD, who was leading the Global Crisis Response Group, to say, this is a crisis of women and girls. And because even in times of food insecurity, it is not just the food, it is more than the food, because that situation also created opportunities for sex trafficking, for increased violence. So we started telling them, this is not a crisis of food. It is not a crisis of numbers. It is actually a crisis of people. And if we think of it as a crisis of people, then we allow ourselves to think about people in their diversities. We allow ourselves to think about women and girls in their diversity, in the multiple dimensions through which they are marginalized. So just to say, we still have a lot of work. I had the impassioned plea from the civil society group in the plenary earlier today. We still have a long way to go, but I think we are getting there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jemima, for reminding us the human dimension of this crisis and how women make up the majority of those who suffer from food insecurity, even though they play a fundamental role in food security, including distribution and the incredible gender gap and the widening gender gap in food insecurity. I would like now to move to Irina Wandera, the gender lead of the private sector mechanism. And it would be good, Irina, if you could share with us your perspective on the issue. And also, how do you think that the private sector could contribute to upholding gender equality in all its dimensions? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. And it's always comforting to speak when Jemima is around, because she's a crusader for generating as much data as we need, so that we're able to design interventions that will really help us move forward. And I'll just start with the question on evidence that we have. Swad has pointed out some of that. But with or without evidence, as Norway pointed out in plenary, we need to act. The lack of data or evidence should not be an excuse not to act. So gender-based, sexual and gender-based violence in food systems is a real issue. All the other issues that were pointed out during the negotiations are real issues. And even in 2018, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres acknowledged that violence against women is a global pandemic. So even before COVID, gender violence was a pandemic. So we do not need evidence. We need to act with or without evidence. Even one life matters. You don't need multiple lives, just one life matters. So this was an important signal from the UN leadership, and we are happy that UN Women is supporting this process, and we need them to help us generate as much evidence as possible, if that's the only way forward. And on the part of private sector, we are looking up to the International Labour Organization and others who have established the prevalence and pervasiveness of sexual violence and harassment in agricultural work. And this is pervasive in informal and temporary settings where women are at the highest risk because of unequal power relations, which we can all relate to. Rural and remote areas also exacerbate the risks for women. So unfortunately, very many of these victims do not report cases, as entrenched cultural and social norms, which Jemima has pointed out, increase the likelihood of violence and harassment. So there's a lot of secrecy, shame, and stigmatization associated with sexual and gender-based violence. And this also compounds to the lack of availability of data and evidence. So we have to appreciate the role of entrenched cultural and social norms and the impact they have on the data and how they influence the designing of interventions. So as private sector, we are making progress and commitments to create safe working spaces. Stemming out of the Food Systems Summit, many of our members have joined the Coalition of Action on Decent Work and Living Incomes and Wages. And so the coalition is working towards strengthening labor and human rights, improving labor governance in food systems, promoting decent employment in food systems, especially for the most vulnerable, and strengthening workplace organization and effective social dialogue. We're also looking at the International Labour Organization Code of Conduct on sexual harassment in the workplace, which is a guiding instrument for the private sector. And we're impressing upon our members to strictly adhere to the code, which lays the legal groundwork for safe and healthy work environment, including in the agriculture sector. So as we work on these guidelines and moving forward, we need to look at these references, which of course during the negotiations we pointed this out, and they'll be useful in the path forward. We believe that the UN system should work coherently, like CFS should not work as a silo. So whatever is happening at UNGA, whatever is happening at the Commission of Human Rights should be strengthened through this process. We cannot abandon that and say like, let's just focus on this and that. We appreciate the willingness of member states to go back to the table and work this out, but we really need to address these issues. We cannot just ignore them and imagine that they do not exist, because they exist. Even if it's for one person, it's important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina, for making these links between sexual and gender-based violence with the access to food, and also the discrimination that women and girls face in rural and remote areas, and how cultural and social norms impact the access to food. And thank you for also sharing with us how the private sector is trying to advance the protection of the right to food of women and girls, and for example the coalition on decent work in food systems that you mentioned, especially thinking that women make up the majority of informal workers and have no access usually to social protection or fair and safe working conditions. And then thank you for concluding by reminding us that CFS should not work in silo, but should really benefit from the wealth of the work that is being done at the UN level, including in the human rights mechanism. And speaking about human rights mechanism, we have online the member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, Mrs. Meskerim Jetet Teshan. Thank you for joining us from Ethiopia. We were wondering if you could share with us how we can use the work of UN special procedures to contribute to a consensus on the guidelines that are being discussed here at the CFS, a consensus that would embrace discrimination based as well on sexual orientation and gender identity. Ms. King, the floor is yours.
She's having some technical issues.
Oh, okay. Okay, she's not on the call. Okay, so she will probably join us later. So we will continue now with Mr. Martin de Groot, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada. Welcome. And we're wondering whether you could share with us your perspective on how we could help remove the obstacles LGBTIQ+ people face in realizing the right to food. What do you think there could be a first step, for example, of the CFS? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I really feel honored to be sharing the floor here with Irina and with Jemima. I think the foundation for how we can move forward really is ultimately open dialogue and finding a way to create the spaces. CFS is a unique platform in bringing together a range of stakeholders, of members, of participants in a way that no other body can. And if we want to find ways to take away barriers for the discussion or reflection on LGBTQI participants, people, food producers, members of food systems, I think the only way we can do that is by stepping forward and creating a space to allow that to happen. I think there are lots of insights and people who've been thinking about this, perhaps not in a fully joined up manner. And I think the unique opportunity that CFS has is to bring those strings together so that we can see how they come together and weave something that can support moving forward on this issue. We can't afford to let marginalization continue. And at some point we have to have open conversations about this. And we fully recognize that there's different cultural contexts, different priorities, different orientations around this issue. But in the longer term, we won't do ourselves a service if we don't confront it. Confront it isn't maybe the right word, because that sounds too firm. I think we need to be open about the discussion and find ways to build those bridges. Recognizing that this will be a slow process in Canada as well. It's an evolution for us, as in any country it will be. But the only way to do it is to start. We have to take a first step in having these discussions. And I think to the extent that we can come at these questions with humility and reflect on the fact that we don't all know answers, and there will be different pathways to take away these barriers. There's different ways to overcome a barrier. You can go over it, you can go around it, you can go under it. And I think that's what we have to explore. And CFS gives us a way to do that.
Thank you very much, Martin, for underlining how important an open dialogue would be, and that would actually be a first step for the CFS to tackle this issue, and how different cultural contexts might influence the evolution of this approach, but how you underline that it's the direction in which we are going, as also shown by human rights mechanisms that are recognizing these grounds as prohibited grounds for discrimination. Thank you very much. And I was wondering if our participant is now online, and so I'm going. Then, while maybe we wait for the member of the working group to join us again online, we can start and have a discussion with our audience here in the room and in Zoom. We have roughly 10 minutes for the discussion. In case you have questions or you have comments, also on the way forward, and also if you want to share the evidence you might have collected on these different types of discrimination and its interlinkages with the right to food. Anybody in the room? And then I'll move to the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for this great panel. Yeah, I had a question also linking it with the plenary discussion just before, because I think UN Women made a very good point that behind the numbers there are lives, and I think as CSIPM we have been bringing forward this aspect and the lives from the territories and the experiences of violence and discrimination. And that is why for us, it is also that these are also reflected and addressed by the voluntary guidelines on gender equality, because often we say that what is not mentioned is either invisibilized or unaddressed. However, today we heard in the plenary that we need to understand certain positions, but sometimes for us, this is a very difficult position because for us, it's not just a matter of understanding. In the territories, women, non-cis heteronormative persons are dying and facing marginalization. So how can we, maybe a question to UN Women or Canada, no? How can we make the bridge between what is happening in the territories and this other request of understanding, no? Which is maybe a bit far away from the realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. I don't know who would like to take the floor first.
Not because I have an answer, because it's a really important point you make. And I think one of the things that we are seeing now is this rise of feminist movements around the world. And as UN Women, we work with member states. We are in these negotiations as part of our Commission on the Status of Women. And every day we are pushing for progressive language on some of these issues. And I know there's a lot of conversations about going back to agreed language, but we really want to use agreed language as the base, as where to start from, because we have agreed language that we agreed on 10 years ago. Issues have changed, cultures are changing all the time. So we really want to see the use of agreed language as sort of our starting point, and as much as possible to keep making progress. So there's a couple of things. So that we do, and it's part of the reason why, as UN Women, we've been supporting CFS to, as much as possible, look at the agreed language and see how we can also make progress from that agreed language based on what we know today. The second area is on supporting feminist movements, because those voices from the ground matter. A lot of times they're not supported well enough to bring their voices to the table. And so as part of our Generation Equality Forum, we have an action coalition, just on supporting feminist movements. And a couple of weeks ago, I don't know whether some of you were in New York, we launched an alliance of feminist movements, because we also want to make sure that feminist movements are connected, that when we talk about social justice in Colombia and social justice in Niger, that those feminist movements that are pushing the agenda are connected, because they can share lessons, they can share experiences, their voice becomes a much larger global voice beyond the country. So I can say those are some of the two areas where we are really directly supporting this bringing together of what feminists and feminist movements are dealing with on a day-to-day basis with some of the global negotiations that are going on with member states.
Thank you, Jemima. Martin?
Maybe if I can just try to complement a little bit what Jemima said. I think coming out of the negotiation process and with the idea of finding that communal space again, a key element I think is taking some of these conversations out of the negotiation room, at least for a while. And I take Magdalena's point very much about what's not mentioned is invisibilized. So maybe we need to find other spaces to make things visible and have conversations that perhaps sit outside of the negotiation room, which is a charged space. And maybe as we're reevaluating the way forward, all with a commitment to move forward, but as we think through what the next steps are, maybe there's a moment to take a breath and have some conversations around some of these issues that have been perhaps less visible than we would have liked. And outside of the charged negotiation space, discuss them and make them visible. And those may still be uncomfortable moments, but they'll be separate from negotiation. And to some extent, it's easier to have an open conversation when that's not part of it. I think what was mentioned in terms of making connections and making a larger voice, I think is really important in finding champions from around the world, from across regions, who can speak to these issues and serve as examples and bring those examples into the conversation. And I know that the various stakeholders and members have been trying to do that, but I think that's something that needs to be sustained. Maybe we were rushing too fast and not taking the time to make all of those examples visible, to share the experience of where perhaps an open process, an open approach has been successful and borne fruit for the populations that we're trying to serve and respond to. So I think it's a step-by-step process, and it will take some time, and it probably will never be as fast as we would want it to be. But at least if we're moving in the right direction and finding opportunities, then we can hope that we're doing the right thing in this case.
Thank you very much, Martin, as well. And thank you to Jamina as well for highlighting how a grid language could be a starting point and how to make sure that we involve rights holders in this discussion, including feminist movements. And Martin, thank you for highlighting how important it is to steer consensus by creating other spaces that can be open spaces for discussion and find common ground, so that the things that at the moment, or the parts of gender inequality that are now invisible, can be made visible also in the guidelines. And the importance, as you said, of bringing in the examples of the lived experiences of those that are suffering. Thank you very much. And now in the room, I have a question from CSIPM.
Hola, muchas gracias. Yo soy Andrea Lucy.
Very much. My name is Andrea Lucy. I am from the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism representing Urban Food Insecure. Yesterday, when we started our intervention, we shared our key messages when the people who are impacted by different crises and pandemics. They are voices, lives, stories, dreams that are present with us here. That is why it's very delicate when we use words like invisible. In reality, we're talking of processes that make these people invisible. In reality, it's those of us who are on the ground. We exist on the ground. We don't exist for many governments. We don't exist for our capitals. We don't exist for many processes. But when we are in our lands, when we are on our streets, many of us live in the streets, or when we are in prison, we exist. Maybe we are not seen, but we are there. There are even groups like women who are in prison, and there's no specific food policies for women who are incarcerated. We are sentenced to live with hunger. We're in prison. Women cannot keep their children to feed them in many countries. Prison separates babies from their mothers when they're just months old. Drug policies have driven women more and more into prison. So we have to look at how we can create a different quality of care and life that can place women and LGBTQI plus women in a central stage of public policies, and to have a cross-cutting approach, not just focusing on one service, but all of policies as a whole. And last but not least, for us, the issue of data on LGBTQI plus women and food security data are very important. In the SOFI report, there is no information at all about food insecurity in LGBTQI plus women. National surveys, even surveys by public institutions, don't say a word about food insecurity of LGBTQI plus people. When we come up with public policy for LGBTQI plus women, what data on food security can we use? There are none. Even at universities, there's very little produced on data for LGBTQI+ women. So in this space, we have to envisage adequate methodologies to produce data and ways of funding this, because we see more and more how governments are taking away resources for science and for issues that are so important for all of us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andre, for sharing with us these important considerations on how crucial is to put the most marginalized at the center of public policies, whether it's women, LGBTIQ people, and also how that should also be reflected in the way that states recollect data and how they use it in their public policies. So I think we have now to move to the second segment. I see that there are some questions in the chat, but I will then condense them, consolidate them, and use it for the next round of interaction. She's connected.
Yeah, that's true.
So in moving to this second part of our discussion, we will really look at the draft guidelines and how to ensure the guidelines reflect human rights principles and standards, and how we can ensure from our respective roles, how do we ensure that they are finalized in an inclusive and consultative process. So in theory, this section would start with the UN working group. Yeah. And so I'm going to leave the floor to Meskerim Jezeteshane. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear us? It would be really good to have your views on how all the knowledge that was developed by the special procedures can be harnessed into this process. And if you could share with us reflections on how actually the two topics of women's rights and also discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status, they're actually connected and they reinforce each other, pushing for more equality and substantive equality.
She can't hear us.
So it seems that we still have a technical problem. We will then continue and see if she can connect or hear us before for the next round of questions. So now, in looking at the guidelines, I was wondering whether Irina could share with us how to ensure that in the upcoming process, negotiating the guidelines, what has been achieved in the text, so the good things that have been achieved, how we make sure that those do not get lost. Thank you, Irina.
Thank you, Stefania. And I'll just like to start by saying that the fundamental basis of all our discussions must be human rights. So we should not forget that. We should not have so many preconditions on the right to food. So multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, gender diversity, sexual and gender-based violence are real issues, as we've acknowledged before. And so I know it's difficult for many people, and we are going to require a little bit of courage to confront some of those social norms that are clearly obstacles to realizing gender equality in food systems. We'd like to urge all parties and send Martin, as you continue with building consensus, that we reconsider our hard stances and find common ground. Millions of women are looking up to us here at CFS to to deliver to them an outcome that will make a significant difference in their lives. So how do we overcome these obstacles? I had the privilege of studying in Canada for my master's, and I remember complaining to my professor that, oh, our system back home is still so partisan and patriarchal and everything. Then he told me, like, it has taken Canada over 200 years to move from a very partisan state to what it is today. So we have to continue the conversation. We have to be willing when it doesn't work really to push forward. We should not always, standing down should not always be our first option. Let's continue the conversation. Let's continue engaging, encouraging the divergent voices and try to find common ground. But time is of the essence. We don't have 200 years right now. Like there's so much happening so fast. Today I heard of a new concept, the CCC, climate, COVID, and conflict. Yeah, like there's so much happening that we really need to push forward and very fast, because we are losing a lot. So we have an additional year granted to us. This year should focus on ensuring that the gains that we've already made are not lost. And we commit to adopting a document at an outcome at CFS51. I don't like calling it a document. We need an outcome. So as private sector, we are ready to work with all parties and with all stakeholders to move the process forward. We should work with the agreed texts. I think that should not be reopened. And again, as we said before, let's work together with the rest of the UN system. We need to reorganize the remaining clauses that have not been agreed on into sections that will make it easier to address the difficult issues. And then I just need to remind us that the process for the voluntary guidelines on land tenure was also pretty hard. I think it extended by, is it 2 years? Yeah, but then we got an outcome in the end. So let's press on with the process. As private sector, we are committed to this process. During the negotiations, we demonstrated how initiatives by businesses are overcoming some of the hardest obstacles, including those gender and social norms. We saw how businesses are working with traditional and religious leaders to overcome social and cultural norms. Even within business itself, we know like the patriarchal system has been in existence for long, but businesses are finding the courage to overcome that. And we're seeing businesses putting targets for themselves, committing to those coalitions that came out of the food systems, and really responding to the call really for gender equality. And we are going to see so much more. So really the urge is, let's continue the conversation, but time is of the essence. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Irina, for underlining how we should stand our grounds on the achievements, and in particular, those that are related to human rights, and the importance of dialogue and finding a common ground for the way forward. And thank you also for reminding us of past successes that we had at the CFS, and they could be repeated also in this instance. Thank you very much. I would like now to move to Paula Romero, FIAN Colombia CSIPM, if she could share with us a reflection on the conditions under which we can continue the discussion, and which proposals we could have to move ahead in this process of negotiating the guidelines. Thank you, Paula.
Gracias, Estefanía. Muchas gracias a todas las personas.
Thank you. And thank you to all of those who are joining us here today. Thank you to those members of the panel who are here with us. And the question that you posed, Stefania, is very interesting. So what should take place so as to ensure that we can make progress with these guidelines? Now, it's quite clear that there is a spirit of follow-up that we need to continue, but how should we go about it? What are the conditions which should lead us in this process of continuing? How should we move forward together? So we believe that first and foremost, we must ensure that states and organizations of the universal system of the United Nations of human rights, these all need to guarantee the right language and spirit of human rights. This is of fundamental importance. This means that we have to move forward with progressive and transformational language, which interprets the current reality of different forms of oppression, which can be seen among women, girls, and non-heteronormative individuals. Much of this language is already recognized formally and interpreted at the United Nations, but it's often not interpreted in a progressive way, and this is what needs to be done. For example, intersectionality, food sovereignty, the rights of peasant farmers, that peasant rights are already, and these other rights are already enshrined in the United Nations. Reproductive rights, sexual rights, rights for heteronormative, non-heteronormative people. And these are all rights that have been touched upon in United Nations texts in one way or another, but we have to go further than that. We have to recognize that the status quo of the patriarchy is causing oppression, and that really continues. And if we don't actually make any progress, then we will never see real transformation. And then we also need to move forward in terms of the human rights spirit. So what does this mean? This means that the UN has to understand and move forward with its history. It has to provide a substantial response, a concrete response to changing the lives of women at territory level. This involves recognition for the different forms of oppression which exist. There are unfair discrimination forms which prevent people realizing their right to food. So, for example, when peasant women are displaced because of war and when they have to leave behind their crops, when women in cities do not have access to real food, when they only have access to ultra-processed food, and then which is not truly edible, and then women are prevented from getting water, when non-heteronormative women are discriminated against and cannot participate in the food system, when women do not have their knowledge recognized in decision-making in political bodies related to food systems. And then in terms of war, I see this a lot in my own country. In the context of war, often women are seen as war booty and they suffer hunger. They are victimized and objectified. We need to consolidate a consensus based on a transformative vision. States at this moment in time have within their hands a unique opportunity to recognize the rights of women. Women are the ones who feed the world and who take care for others, and we have a chance to redistribute this task of care. Now, Stefania, you are asking me, what are the conditions that we can apply to continue this discussion, to continue with these guidelines? Well, the conditions can be, first and foremost, obtaining clarity on what the standards are for our negotiations. So we have to be clear on what are the methodologies for building the way we work. How do we actually want to work together? How do we actually want to build consensus? It's quite clear that there are regressive positions. There is an unfair power balance, and there are many institutional flaws. But we should not be scared at questioning the different forms of intersectionality and the different forms of discrimination. And this means that we have to focus on the structural causes and not on the symptoms. And this is coherent with the terms of reference of the mandate of the guidelines. We can actually see this written there. And the food security, the CFS, is already known as the foremost participatory body in food systems, and therefore we need democratic progress. There has to be coherent progress with clear, transparent forms of decision-making and clear principles which are aligned with CFS principles. There also has to be a space for experts, and that has not been seen in the negotiation of the last negotiation phase of these guidelines. And this and information arguments have to be put forward which are not tainted by conflicts of interest in order to elaborate public policy properly, basing ourselves on evidence. And maybe we could call upon the HLP, the high-level panel of experts. We could ask them to speak. Also, other UN bodies should guide us on this, and data should go beyond what is simply evident. There are many aspects that are not recorded and reflected in data. Data has been has suffered an androcentric approach. We have to create new variables which bring about a transformation and move away from the androcentric approach that has characterized our systems. This also means that women, we are not simply figures, we're not just numbers. We have to go beyond that. We have to be very creative in developing these methodologies. Finally, states must have an open and inclusive approach and position. If this is not done, there is no way of changing history, because we will see the same conditions, perpetuating the same conditions, continuing as we move forward. And I would like to invite you, those of you in the room, we can give you a printed copy of our statement as the CSIPM, and you can also find it online, and you can join these efforts. You can sign up and help us in this move. You can help us to move forward on this. Thank you very much, Paula.
Thank
you for explaining that the conditions to continue these guidelines is both in terms of the content, but also the process and how it actually moves forward. And if we look at the content of the guidelines, they should really respond.
They really have to face the different challenges that women and non-binary people face in their daily life. So thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us also of the importance of how the other UN agencies could help these negotiations, and including treaty bodies and special procedures. Now, moving back to Jamima, I was wondering, Jamima, whether you had any advice to give us on how to better disseminate the wealth of evidence of structural gender discrimination that also UN Women has produced among CFS members, so that it informs the negotiations and also the guidelines.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that has been our main role during the negotiations. How do we bring some of the existing language in other conventions, human rights conventions, the language we have from the Beijing platform, which then was very transformational in actually putting the gender equality agenda on the table, and all the gains and other conventions that have come up after that, you know, the ILO conventions and decent work, and so many others that I can't actually mention. But the other thing we also really want to bring to the fore is that the past 7 years, especially, we have seen a lot of backlash. We have seen a lot of going back in terms of gender equality and women's rights. So there's this sense that some of the gains that we are achieving in development are not being shared equally. That wealth and power is concentrated on a few. Economic insecurity, economic injustice is becoming more more widespread. But we are also concerned that we are also seeing a lot of exclusionary politics as well, grounded in a lot of misogyny, a lot of patriarchy. I think that is not lost to us as UN Women. So there's increasing backlash. We've been standing in solidarity with the women of Iran, with the women of Afghanistan. But despite all that, what we see across the globe is also a lot of energy, especially from young feminist movements. And we are being very, very intentional about supporting those movements. Now, amidst these challenging political circumstances that we find ourselves in, and what I want to say is some of those political circumstances, I think, is what we see reflected in the negotiating, in the negotiation tables as well. But amidst all this, we really must continue to provide, as UN agencies, as she mentioned, the technical expertise, some of the evidence, including that which is not documented, the evidence of people's lived experiences. We have to continue to provide that. But more importantly, what we really hope we can do is, what I also see is there is a lot of there's a lot of words, and we need to go behind these words and really make sure that we are interrogating what this means and that people are all having the same understanding of some of these issues. I tell my colleagues, there's times you're sitting in a room and you mention intersectionality, and you can see people's minds just go to one thing that they're not happy or excited or do not agree with when you mention the word intersectionality, and forget the broad sense in which we use these words. So part of what we hope we can bring as UN Women is also that broadening of people's minds, that creating this space where we are actually coming to a common understanding. What's behind these words? What are people's lived experiences behind these words that we are negotiating around, all that, you know, different members feel so strongly about. So we hope we can also bring that to the table. As I mentioned before, we want to bring the agreed language as well. One thing, because we do not want to be going back from agreed language. We want that to serve at least as the minimum starting point, because we cannot afford to go back more on the gains that we have made. And so part of what my team does with CFS is to bring that agreed language from different spaces, the Human Rights Council, the ILO conventions, even with our own agreed language from CSW, because member states are debating every year at CSW on different topics. And so we want to bring that so that we know we are not going back on what has already been agreed. And for us, we see this as our mandate, as our UN mandate. But what we also really are hoping to see, it's one thing to have agreed language and all these big words, but we want to bring the lived experiences of people to these negotiating rooms as well, and whether there are spaces where we're talking about this and then it comes to the negotiation rooms, or whether it is part of this, what CSIPM brings to the table. I think we want to continue to see that, because those that are most affected by these issues actually have a much better articulation of how these issues affect them, in what ways they affect them, and what the solutions what the solutions can be. And so we really stand ready as UN Women to continue engaging, to continue supporting the process, including this expanding of understanding of what is really behind a lot of these concepts, but to also continually work at country level to bring this awareness as well, even outside of the negotiation rooms, especially in countries where we do have important programming that's focused on women's rights, to actually continue reminding stakeholders that these issues are important. It is the reason why we are investing in them together with member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jemima, for sharing with us these different strategies through which we can bring this knowledge and this data that and the human dimension that is behind behind the data. And one last question for Martin on how the CFS can continue working towards gender equality beyond the guidelines, and how to continue a meaningful debate where there seems to be such a backlash. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Stefania. And I think it builds on a lot of what was just shared. To continue a discussion, I think we need to remember that CFS is many things, and one open-ended working group is not everything. We tend to focus a lot on particular products, particular processes, but the CFS brings a lot more in terms of a convening power, plenary discussions, monitoring of results. And I think we need to keep our mind open to the fact that we have a diverse constituency of members and stakeholders who can make use of that. It sort of goes along the lines of what I mentioned earlier. And I think it's entirely fair for us to think that given the centrality of gender equality and these considerations of inclusion in food security and food systems, that this is something that touches all of the work streams, all of the events that and processes that are in motion within CFS. And I think we as members and stakeholders kind of have to own that and find those opportunities to keep the conversation going. And that's both within the CFS and outside of it. I think the sparks that came out of the process over the last year have given us all food for thought that we can then take back to our constituencies, to our countries, to our members, and have discussions. I think Jemima's point on recognizing that the crisis response group was gender blind, that's a good example of taking something into a forum where we have opportunities to share these insights and try to insert them. And I think to some extent that's incumbent on us all to look at where the opportunities are. We all have resources at our disposal, tangible or intangible, that we can make use of to try to keep it going. And that is partly inside the CFS and partly outside of that. I think to the extent that we can take responsibility ourselves as participants in CFS, we can apply some of these lessons to the work that we do. We can apply gender-based analysis plus. We can try to generate the evidence base. We can try to establish innovations and then harvest that information back in a way that we can then share with each other. And trying to own that and occupy that space a little bit, I think takes resources again, but a sort of an intentional process of thinking we need to capture this and we need to share this. And it's not just a separate open-ended working group that is the moment for it. And then using that with the data and evidence that we can draw from that, I think going back to Andre's point earlier on the need for data, we may not have sort of the complete data set, but we have examples, we have pieces of the data that we can then bring to bear. I think the example from the SOFI report from 2011, which has this one data point that everyone quotes, and we just have to have a few more of those data points that we continue to quote and bring back to the conversation to keep that moving, because things have changed and will continue to change. And so I think as we're looking forward to what CFS will be doing, obviously we're trying to keep the open-ended working group going. I think there was encouraging new sort of sounds from the room this morning. So I think we're confident that we'll be able to move that forward and get to some consensus. But at the same time, there's the data work stream coming up. That's a golden opportunity for us to have this conversation. There's going to be an inequality work stream, another golden opportunity to have conversations around this. So I think we can look across the package that CFS is and insert gender equality considerations, inclusion considerations throughout. And from our part, certainly, we're happy to keep sharing the experiences that we've had, both domestically and abroad, and see if it creates a spark for others to try to work with us. And I think what's really encouraging is that we're all here this afternoon, right? We're all here ready to talk about this and to keep a conversation going. And I think that gives me optimism that both within the open-ended working group and in other fora, we'll be able to draw on the knowledge and experience of all of you to get going on this. And I think just from a broad perspective, a few years ago, our Prime Minister said, diversity is a reality and inclusion is a choice. And I think we just have to help the CFS make the right choice. And that's what we can do. We have our voices to do that. And that's where we should put our energy.
Sure, yeah, it's very good. Thank you, Martin, for sharing with us also some crystal clear paths forward in the different work streams of the CFS, the data work stream and also the inequality work stream. So thank you very much. We have received a lot of questions from the chat, but we don't have really the time to address them since we are already over time. And I would like simply to conclude the event so that you will also have the time to reach the plenary in saying that I think that the various speakers have really shown the importance of embracing this process and of bringing the content of human rights into the definition of what non-discrimination and equality is. And I see all the different parts of the CFS really committed towards this topic. So we look forward to see you in the plenary and to continue this work together within the CFS.